Okay, so we actually are really excited by this book because a lot of the questions we kind of get about socialism and about communism more broadly is like, well, how are we going to organize the economy? And there's a lot of like nuts and bolts questions that people are, they really like the idea of socialism, but they don't necessarily know how everything's going to fit together. And you do need people to figure those things out, people that are good at math and science. And we,
I'm not good at it.
Yeah,
actually,
no,
so.
we get stoned and watch Tarkovsky movies. That's our thing. So we're happy to have more sciencey minded technical people here with us to explain it to us. During which we will glaze over, but kind of try and repeat at dinner parties. But I guess to start out, you guys started with Walmart as your model. Like that's your entry point into planning.
I don't know. It's a model.
As an entry point, for
As
sure.
an entry point, yeah, for sure, yeah.
Why Walmart?
Well, the socks.
I don't know if you know this, but Walmart's real bad.
The socks are so cheap, you know.
I do buy my socks there. Well, not these ones that I'm wearing right now, but I do. Yeah, I mean by the bag load, 12.
Yeah, by the crate,
by the bushel,
pound, yeah.
Because probably the strongest argument that the right has ever mounted against the left, against the idea of socialism, and it's a really bloody good argument, is that
he's Canadian. He's allowed to say that.
I'm allowed to say bloody.
Yeah.
Is that the volume, the sheer infinitude of variables within the supply chain of the production of myriad different products and services is that all of that is encapsulated in the price signal in the market. To be able to replace that with planning would supposedly require an army of bureaucrats, or more laterally, within what is called the economic calculation debate, which is about this, just mathematically impossible to fully capture the infinitude of all those variables.
Yeah, and even if it was, prices also help discover new information. So you'd have all these problems about finding out what new socks people need or whatever, because that wouldn't be contained in any of the information that the planners would have. That was the argument, at least, that the price signal sort of contains all the information that we have now in a nice sort of easy nuggets, and helps us find new information in really efficient ways.
And then also with the historical example of central planning that's always brought up is like late era Soviet Union,
Right.
where it was just this farce where like a bureaucrat was deciding how many bristles would be in like a single toothbrush or something like that. Like that's always brought up as like why the idea of like why central planning doesn't work, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. We spend a couple of chapters talking about the Soviet Union, but the argument historically made by the right, by the people like von Mises and Hayek, was that because of this impossibility of being able to try to capture all of this information that is otherwise supposedly encapsulated in the price signal by an army of bureaucrats or by computation, it will inevitably fail because of that. It can't capture all of that. Therefore, that will really result in chaos. That chaos will result in a sort of leading towards authoritarianism. Bada bing, bada boom. You have Stalin. But that's not how it worked out historically. That's not exactly how it happened. It's sort of the reverse. It was the authoritarianism that undermined the planning. If you're on a collective farm or in a factory or whatever, and the plan comes down and says you must produce a certain target of widgets by November, and you haven't done it, you are very, very scared that you're going to be sent off to the gulag or even shot, and so you will lie about that information. You'll say you've met your target or you even beat your target.
Yeah, and lower your target in order to enable you to
do that.
To beat it. Yeah. Like we are only capable of producing 1,000 toothbrush bristles, and then we produce 10,000, and we're great Stakhanovites.
And why do you use the example of these gigantic corporations like Walmart or Amazon, right, for example, as an like how do they employ central planning?
Right. So this was an absolutely fantastic argument from the right. It's a really bloody good argument. But here's the thing: is that if planning is impossible at scale, then Walmart shouldn't exist. Because while Walmart exists, external to Walmart is the market. It exists within the market. Internally, it's entirely planned. And Walmart is, if it were a country, it'd be on the scale of a Sweden or a Switzerland. It is the largest private sector employer in the world. It's the third largest employer in the world, period, after the People's Liberation Army and the Pentagon. So Walmart shouldn't, it's entirely internally planned with millions of products, with millions of separate supply chains. So according to the argument of the right within the economic calculation debate, that economic planning at scale does not work. It cannot work. It's impossible. You will inevitably have Stalinist authoritarianism and just utter collapse and inefficiency. The Walmarts of the world shouldn't exist.
And you just end up with Walton authoritarianism.
Well, yeah, but internally Walmart is sort of authoritarian, or like Amazon to their own employees, to pull off this miracle of distribution and efficiency.
Yeah. But at the same time, as for consumers, they are incredibly impressive and effective.
Yeah.
And like the example I do use in terms of like markets was always, it's like a very old Onion headline. I don't know if you remember this or if you have this in Canada, but
we have the
it's
Onion.
One of my favorite. No, but the reference: continued existence of edible arrangements disproves central tenets of capitalism. So the idea that like capitalism doesn't create completely undesirable things constantly and isn't full of waste is rather silly. And we do have things like Amazon Prime here. We're just like, if we just owned that. If it was like democratically controlled, that would be the coolest service in the world. We would have such an efficient society.
Yeah, there's certainly the argument. Socialists should never be saying that capitalism only produces things that we don't want. We all want underwear, presumably. Well, not all the time, but and that's a profitable commodity. So the Gap produces it for us. But sometimes there are things that are not profitable, and so they don't produce them, like new classes of antibiotic. Or sometimes there are things that are profitable, but we know that are harmful and we don't want them, like fossil fuels. But because they're profitable, they will continue to be produced in the absence of some sort of non-market intervention to prevent that from happening, i.e. planning.
Yeah, it's basically sort of irrational production, what we would call it. And in many ways, going back to that sort of question of authoritarianism, I mean, one of the other things in the book is we have a chapter on the USSR. The USSR was a failure. It was completely authoritarian, but we want to tar sort of capitalism with that same brush, at least to a certain extent. And
capitalism is pretty authoritarian.
Show that exactly. But we don't talk about it enough, just how authoritarian the workplace is and just how authoritarian the conditions are under which so many of us spend, so much of our working lives. And to talk about planning under capitalism as also a kind of authoritarian planning.
Yeah, you could say that Walmart is in effect a Soviet Union. It's not quite on the scale of the Soviet Union, but it's pretty damn close in terms of its revenues.
So if we were to understand or think of Walmart or Amazon as basically like a capitalist state within a global market.
A Stalinist state.
A Stalinist state within a global market that is interacting with a global capitalist economy. Internally, when we say they employ central planning, I don't just want to skate over that. What does that actually mean in terms of from the CEO of Walmart or the CEO of Amazon, from Jeff Bezos to the person wetting themselves in one of their gulag fulfillment centers? What is that central planning? What is their plan?
How does it work?
And how does it work?
Manager.
I mean, in the most basic sense, it's just the fact that there's not an auctioneer in the warehouse calling out and this is kind of in many ways the kind of utopian vision of capitalism is everything would be have the auctioneer calling out in the warehouse being who's going to take that box to that shelf, 50 cents, can I hear 50, 51, 52, and then people all right, I'll do it for 52 and I'll do it. The boss says you will move, not even the boss. It's your handheld robo device tells you now have 5 seconds left.
The algorithm tells you
before I self-destruct to move these boxes. So I mean that's the kind of everyday authoritarianism and planning, and then that kind of planning goes. Then there's the middle managers who tell the managers what to do and all of that. We had a question at did an event in Toronto yesterday, and there was a good question there. It's people saying, the corporation doesn't look the same everywhere. Like not every company functions in the same way. Some are much more sort of, the planning and the management is much more top down. Some we have the sort of foil for Walmart in the book is Sears, which is like a comical example of someone trying to introduce a market into the company and then just like a spectacular
I'm really glad you brought up the Sears example. Our friend of the show and former producer Brendan James wrote a review of your guys' book in The Baffler. And the Sears example is a really funny one because it shows the example of like, we think that these corporations, like they embody the capitalist values that they espouse. And Sears was an example of a CEO, like the CEO literally was like an objectivist Randian and decided to internally run the company not based on authoritarian central planning, but on like objectivist individual competition at every level.
Yes.
And the answer is like, for those listening, when was the last time you saw Sears? Do you remember Sears at all? I kind of do, but it's sort of gone away. Could you talk about what like the Sears examples, what happened when they instituted those libertarian concepts within a corporate structure?
It was a complete disaster. The CEO Eddie Lampert, when he took over, he was such a Randian that when he took over, he looked inside the box, was horrified to see that it's entirely internally planned. He felt that this is basically communism. And because he was such a Randian, he thought that the way to solve this was to introduce an internal market, to get different departments competing against each other with separate in exchanges of items between them, but not on the basis of planning or cooperation, but on the basis of competition. And so inevitably, the different departments would hide information from other departments, which resulted in terrible competition.
It's like a reality TV show.
I
didn't start this company to make friends. Okay?
It was an utter disaster. There would be, what was the famous example? Because I guess the tools department wanted a particular tool on the cover of the Mother's Day promotional flyer, and they didn't care that the women's clothing department might be or the perfume or whatever might be a bit more appropriate on the cover because they were in competition with that. Even though overall, because of that undermined the profitability of the company, of the organization.
Right.
So effectively, this is the same as what happens in so each of those different departments effectively became their own little companies, competing against each other to the detriment of the overall organization. Yeah. Well, what does that sound like to us? Different companies competing against each other to the detriment of our overall organization, i.e. society.
They tried to do something similar, I remember, with Zappos, where they kind of diffused the entire organizational chain, and they tried to say like, well, we're going to make it all horizontal and everyone just move around like nodes. Right. And they gave all the employees like the option of 6 months severance to quit or to like stay in this bold new experiment, which they tried to argue was anti-authoritarian. They tried to say like, oh, well, it's bossless. No one has a boss or whatever. And what actually ends up happening is everyone is everyone's boss. And it completely collapsed. And like 3 months later, they were like, oh my God, we're going back to the regular. And like almost everyone stayed because that intense like Silicon Valley, like bold new experiment, spontaneity is always good kind of libertarian mindset is so like deeply inured in their brains. And it was just like immediate chaos, and it almost tanked this incredibly like profitable company. And they were just immediately like, yeah, no, never mind. This was a dumb idea. This is bullshit.
Well, and the limit of that is something like Uber, where everyone is their own boss, except the conditions are still set by the company. All the risk is hived off onto you. You have your own car, you pay your own insurance, gas, and everything. And then Uber says, but we're going to pay you 60 cents per mile. And I recently read that I think that's the reason that LA drivers struck was that, again, that was another city where they lowered quote unquote wages. That's, we say wages, they say payments to independent entrepreneurs and rising stars of business. But and I think they lowered them to something like 60 cents per mile. And I believe it's the government that's like the government set kind of rate for reimbursement is like 54 cents a mile. Like that's what. So you're basically not giving people the ability to even, never mind make like a minimum wage, like just like barely cover their costs with what you're paying them.
So Sears and their CEO, the Randian CEO, Eddie Lampert, is an example of what happens when you apply capitalist competition, the principles of individual competition and liberty and self-government within a corporate structure. So how do the Waltons do it? How does Walmart do it in contrast to Sears?
So what's really fascinating in doing the research on what made Walmart successful. So, I troll through business scholars, commerce scholars, operations research analysts, and so
really sexy stuff.
It's pretty dry. And there's some particular technological advances that have allowed this. That is the crucial thing. But one of the really striking things is that they mention is cooperation all along the supply chain. Basically the firmification of the entire supply chain. So suppliers, to some extent, are basically making decisions about what will be stocked on the shelves rather than Walmart themselves, and very far down the supply chain. But in order to be able to make those decisions, Walmart itself has to share moment to moment or even second to second information about sales and so on and so forth with their suppliers. And so the conceiving of this as a sort of competitive operation sort of falls apart. These commerce scholars insist that the crucial thing is cooperation, is sharing, is trust. These lovely kumbaya words, these communist words. But what has enabled that sharing of information is also the technological advances since the 1970s, crucially. And now we're moving into an era of big data and machine learning, which is furthering this ability of cooperation and sharing of information on a much greater level.
So the machine learning kind of technology is essentially like taking the place of what would 40 years ago be like thousands of bureaucrats, right?
Yeah, or what it would be. It's Hayek, when he made sort of that argument that Leigh said at the beginning against, who's now known as one of the great grandfathers of neoliberalism. And that's really who he was. Who was an economist, Austrian sort of economist in the 40s. When he made those arguments against planning, he literally called prices action at a distance, which kind of, at the time it was like this magical thing that transmits information over great distances in short time. Mm-hmm. And now you're like, that's kind of funny because we have thousands of miles of fiber optic cable around the globe, which is, not to say that there isn't a social element, but like a lot of that information we can get directly, mm-hmm. and we can get a lot more sort of qualitatively different information, not just all of it sort of compressed into prices. Like that kind of idea of like this magical action at a distance, it makes sense in the age of the telegraph, right. A lot less.
Well, and it works specifically though, because like the coordination between all of these Walmarts works specifically because it's at a certain scale.
Or rather, the scale is permitted as a result of the cooperation and the sharing of information.
Oh, go on.
Well, again, it's sort of the other way around. The ability to coordinate all that, the amount of transactions and the distribution of all these goods and services across so many Walmarts is enabled by this sharing of information and this technological, sort of effectively a revolution. I mean, I think to some extent we have to recognize that you can go back to Marx talking about how there needed to be a certain level of what he called, development of the forces of production. Basically, he means technology and a few other things. But there needed to be a certain level of economic development before you could achieve socialism. Mm-hmm. And I think we basically have to recognize that the ability for us to replace inegalitarian, irrational markets with democratic planning has been made more feasible by some of the technological changes that have happened since the 1970s. That's not entirely it, but that is.
Well, we can't, and that's the thing. That's the first half, and then the other half is of course us, is like is society and the social part of that. I mean, another thing that goes back to Marx is he literally said something like, capitalism teaches us in a way social cooperation, like the fact that you have that you start getting industrial production, you get these big factories, it doesn't teaches us in the sense that it shows us that we need sort of that society is a collective project, that it's all of us working together to kind of reproduce society. And it's easier to forget about that when you're sort of, tilling your own plot of land and then going to, to the market once every 2 weeks and giving stuff to the Lord. It's a lot easier when you're like, although it's horrific in a way too, right? But when you're like 1 out of 2,000 people working at power looms and for 16 hours, you're like, holy shit, we all like rely on each other, and production is this really social thing. And the point of the book is to say, yes, right? Like that's totally correct. Now, could we run it in our interest? Could it actually be, social in some meaningful way, not in a way that, again, it's like that, who's the dictator, who's telling us what to do and what the goals of all of this are. And I think that's the sort of counterpoint to the not counterpoint. That's the super important sort of, fulfillment of that point about technology too.
Absolutely. All that Walmart and Amazon show is that authoritarian planning or the planning is possible. It doesn't. It's up to us to take those over and democratize those systems.
Well, okay, so you're working very much in the tradition of Marx, who was a great admirer of all the fancy treats that capitalism brought us.
He was indeed, yeah, absolutely.
He loved that stuff. Stuff is cool, free time is cool, and theoretically those technological advancements could bring us this. But the obvious right-wing rebuttal to this, that I'm sure you've already heard 1,000 times, is that, well, actually, this kind of super efficiency is only possible due to the exploitation, due to this kind of subjugation of workers. And what is your response to that, just so our listeners can know what to tell their terrible families at Thanksgiving?
To a degree, it's true. Like no one would vote themselves into, that's what you would think. No one would vote themselves into being like a Walmart or Amazon warehouse worker, like into this dystopian hellscape. Like you would not be like, yes, I will do this so that everyone else can have.
Not only that, I read an article about what the people who work for Amazon in forgetting the fulfillment centers, just in like the middle management or upper echelons of middle man. I wouldn't vote myself into that. That sounds fucking like a nightmare.
Yeah.
There was a great
there's internal controls and efficiency and pressure that even the people who are making good money are put under seems totally inhuman.
10%
to me.
Neoliberalism has made it so that being management isn't even worth it. Yeah.
Well, to a degree, there's a trade-off, but you'd think there'd also be a trade-off between like what we produce and free time. On the other hand, like I think sort of in a sense, we don't know because it would be a democratic process. And I think you just have like different criteria, like socialist efficiency would look different than capitalist efficiency. You'd still want to make like the most stuff that you could with the least amount of materials and then you could add different criteria that capitalism doesn't add in like the most ecologically sustainable way. And in a way that do we want to add more leisure time or add more whatever?
So like in this part of the planning or like giant social algorithm, like if we're democratically controlled, some of the inputs would be, for instance, the ecological damage done by the production of a given good or service, and also the free time that it enables the people creating it, or like leisure time or things like that could go into the planning of these things.
Leisure time, the type of work, what work looks like could go into that. So, I mean,
we can choose to, as a group of workers, we could choose to make more widgets, or decide, well, actually, we think we've got enough widgets at the moment, but this efficiency, the technological changes have allowed us to reduce the amount of time it takes to make the same number of widgets. So we could have a shorter work week, or we could produce more widgets. Which would we like? And it's up to us. Whereas the capitalist, the only option for him or her is maximization of profit. These other options are off the table. That's not to say we wouldn't want to produce more widgets. Sometimes we might want to produce more widgets. But I would even go so far as to say that there are already existing examples of non-market transactions, non-market production and distribution in the world. the United States doesn't have a public healthcare system, but most other Western countries do have some level of public healthcare provision. The UK, their National Health Service, if you compare, and in Canada we have a single payer system. In terms of efficiency, we spend far less per capita on healthcare than the United States does. So even from a capitalist, the point of view of the conceptions of efficiency, economic efficiency, our system, the plan system, is more efficient. Even before we get to other questions, much more democratically interesting questions.
Funnily enough, we talked about this with Rob Delaney about the NHS, where like the idea is like, oh, it's like ration care, but like it's ration. I mean, obviously, our American system care is ration too.
Right, it's just price
Like,
ration.
yeah,
exactly.
Like and like whereas like the counterexample for Canada or the NHS is like, oh, if you need like a hip replacement or something like that, you have to wait a really long time, and like it's rationed that those are longer wait times for those things. However, the things that get the more immediate care are like cancer.
Yeah.
Or the things are like if you're dying right now, rather than like you have to
Your
wait for
arm
a
is
medical.
severed, then we need to sew it
rather
back
than
on.
you have to wait longer
can
for a medical
triage if you
device.
want.
Yeah, exactly.
No, it's exactly. It's called triage. Like it happens in the ER room, and then it happens in the healthcare system as a whole. And then and the question then is, how much as society do you want to devote of your total social resources, like to make that triage faster or whatever, right? If we devoted 5% more of GDP in Canada or in the UK, theoretically, you'd have all those things could be done a lot faster, but then we'd be doing less of other things. And ideally, like that's what you'd want kind of democratic decision making on this kind of big scale to look like.
Yeah, it is funny when you realize that this isn't even something like healthcare in particular in the mindset of people from other countries. And I was talking to like really smart economist who's like a monetary historian, Oisin Gilmore, and I was trying to ask him about like inflation or something like that. And I was like, how do you measure real prices? And he went to this big long thing, and I'm like, oh, but like something like healthcare would be more in America just because of the way price. He's like, well, healthcare is pretty consistent. And then like he texted me like 3 minutes later, he's like, no, I checked, your healthcare is insanely expensive. Like he's he like didn't even consider it. He was just like he's like, it's actually like ridiculous. He's like, I didn't even think that would be your market would be that inefficient.
Yeah,
look at the
of
jump, like for instance, like the jump in price of like insulin over the last 10,
it's
20 years
insane.
or something like that.
People are going without insulin.
Yeah.
No, exactly. It's insane, and that's been one of the main things that's actually been keeping the U.S. out of sort of deflation over the kind of long haul, is the fact of this like huge inflation in healthcare costs, college costs, and these two big like sort of privatized sectors of kind of social care, higher education and healthcare have actually been driving like price increases because they're left to the market. I mean, we saw some of that in terms of that kind of efficiency stuff. We saw some of that in the NHS, and we have a chapter on the NHS. We call it nationalization is not enough. Also, not to just sort of like confuse what we're saying with, it's okay if we just like nationalize everything and that's good. Leave everything the same internally. Like that's the whole point of the democracy, is to transform it sort of, from bottom to top, ideally, in a way that's democratic. Unfortunately, what happened to the NHS is they actually went sort of in reverse and took some of the lessons from our old friend Eddie Lampert from Sears and actually applied them. These are ideas generated under Margaret Thatcher and then applied by John Major and our third way friend Tony Blair to create this kind of internal market within the NHS to make it kind of like the U.S. parts of it, kind of like the U.S. system, but still inside a kind of public system. But now you have sort of like providers and purchasers, this like insane web of contracts between different units within the healthcare system, instead of the kind of planning where it's like, no, we will, do this and you will provide these services. It's like, it is this kind of like, who will provide this operation for $10,000? Do I hear 9,000? And the first thing they had to do to make this run is hire like thousands of managers and ballooning administrative costs to the detriment of actual like care of patients.
There's a really, really good British television show that's like one of these dark discomfort comedies called Getting On, that's about sort of like austerity in NHS. And as Americans do, we completely just wrote the whole pilot again with American actors and had our own version of it for HBO. And of course, literally every episode after that had to be completely different because the entire premise of an NHS style hospital does not work for America.
Right. Yeah.
But it was actually interesting because it gave you a good, I mean, obviously like the American version was, it was more barbaric. Obviously it was more barbaric. But the British version, you got to see what, say, austerity could do to an NHS.
Right.
And all the little things, because it's about nurses. It's set in like a geriatric ward of a hospital or whatever. And you saw like all the little ways that introducing competition into something that should be a social good made everything miserable for the nurses, for the doctors, and obviously for the patients and their families.
Oh, we should really interrogate the capitalist claim that markets are incredibly efficient compared to any other.
Yeah, that's the big argument, is that they're deft and they can move quickly
exactly.
and they
They're
can
nimble,
adjust to
they're,
new. But
No.
you used a great example about like antibiotics.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can go back to Marx. I mean, there is historically.
You can always go back.
can always
to
go
Marx.
back.
You could always get back to Marx. It's not going anywhere.
The problem of markets is not just about inequality or lack of workers' control, thus domination and alienation, but also Marx talked about irrational production, because of the fact that markets limit production just to that which is profitable. But the thing is that there's while there's, as we were talking before, the underwear is certainly both useful and profitable, and that's a happy coincidence. But they will. There's a whole range of useful items or beneficial items that, if they're not profitable, they won't be produced. And today, probably the most obvious example of that would be, new classes of antibiotic in the face of growing antimicrobial resistance. We are a couple of decades away from effectively a sort of Victorian era of medicine, because of the scale of antimicrobial resistance. Almost all of modern medicine depends upon this background of antimicrobial protection from surgery, certainly, but also just injections or catheters, or even many diagnostic procedures depend on this depend on antibiotics. But Big Pharma got out of the business of research and development into antibiotics, but also clinical trials and commercialization and production, and even just manufacture of these about 3 decades ago. And this is mainly because if you take a course of antibiotics over 2 or 3 weeks, at the end of that, hopefully, I mean, if they work, then your infection's done. Like, you don't have the infection anymore. Maybe tuberculosis, maybe 5-6 months of a course of drugs. But again, after the end of that, you're done. You don't have the infection anymore. So you're not selling those drugs to that person. It's much more profitable to be producing drugs for some sort of chronic disease, for somebody who has to take those drugs every day for the rest of their life. So you can speak to the CDC, European chief scientific officers, all of the experts who write about and research antimicrobial resistance argue that the reason that we're facing this crisis, which is probably more of an existential crisis than probably climate change, at least because it's going to be happening a lot sooner, say that it's market failure. That these companies have basically in the arms race, in the war, the unremitting evolutionary arms race with bugs, these companies have gone AWOL because of a lack of profitability. Well, this is completely irrational. This set of goods should be produced for any rational society. That's completely inefficient. That this isn't happening. We could talk about the other side as well, if you like, with respect to fossil fuels, which is the example where if something is harmful, and we know that it's harmful, no matter how much we know about how harmful it is, if it's profitable, it will still be produced, and that's a fundamental cause of
right.
the
But what are all
change.
these new op-eds I'm reading that say, "Can Shell Oil save us from climate change?" And it's like, you know what? Maybe they could, but that's not the right question. Are they going to? What's their
They would if it were profitable.
Exactly.
They would if it were profitable.
So like,
Give them enough money.
so like, let's say we like, in if we're living under the People's Republic of Walmart, you know,
Right.
like if we switch to a centrally planned economy rather than a market economy, it would be easier to make the rational decision to produce the antibiotics that we need not to die from very basic
Yeah, because
things.
we would just democratically decide that's what we're going to produce, and it doesn't matter that it's unprofitable. We would just produce it.
The other example I think of that like comes to mind is palliative care. So it like really hurts to die and it really sucks, but making it less painful, you are not going to get returns on that at all. Like end of life stuff, it's completely there's a really good book by a woman called Ann Newman about this. And it's just like because of how profit motivated like we are, there's just no way to die with any kind of dignity or painlessness in America unless you just have a giant pile of money that you can use to just keep pumping yourself with morphine.
Yeah, look at Sheldon Adelson. He's still out and about.
He's got his little electronic wheelchair and his bodyguards everywhere. But yeah, it's like this thing that produces like a grotesque way of life from cradle to grave.
Yeah, we could. I mean, here's the bizarre thing: is that we could have so much more. Life could be so much better. The promise of socialism is not supposed to be this gray, sort of scarcely of like everybody living, wearing sackcloth.
Everyone's got the unitard. Everyone's
Yeah.
got like the
Gray
the gray
unisex
unitard, like the same ugly haircuts.
One
and, like,
size fits
you
none.
You go to the store and there's like no product and like there's no colorful boxes. It just says cereal, like government cereal, and it's the same shit. But then again, as our friends Brett and Brian pointed out about the cereal or supermarket example, like it's all just the same corn. It's just different colors and dyes.
Yeah,
It's like
open
the same
up the
shit.
box.
It's the
It's a
same
bland
shit. It's just
can.
like a different cartoon character on each box.
Different
So you're
food
saying we can
coloring.
still have the different cereals under all the different cereals we know and love under the People's Republic of Walmart.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, the point is not to imagine what we will and we won't have in terms of what kinds of cereal necessarily. I mean, I think there probably is. It's probably fine to say that there's an irrational differentiation, there's differentiation where there isn't any real difference underlying there. But I think much more interesting than that, because that may, we don't know whether people do actually want those differences. I think much more interesting are things like the bizarre emergence of highly gendered soap packaging.
Right.
Where,
and like the pink tax that goes along with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That, again, that's utterly irrational.
That's why I buy men's razors for my face and legs.
But so that is probably some sort of differentiation that we would democratically say that's absurd. That a household is now forced to buy two different types of razors when they really don't need to because of the enforcement of historic gendering.
I want a body wash for my balls and asshole.
My favorite one that I've seen lately is man yogurt, which just sounds like a
They've
euphemism.
had
this, I
It just
remember
sounds like
this
a
came out in
euphemism.
Poland like 10 years before here, just because Poland is extremely backward.
There's some gender.
That was crazy.
things.
The first time I saw that, I was like, what is in there?
Yeah, I mean it's on the label.
Yeah.
At the same time, we should be very careful again. One of the great internal critiques of Stalinism was that of how gray it was, of the lack of consumer items. There were, no pineapples, no jeans, no Elvis records. When we want bread, but we
Some
want
of that
roses.
may have been rational.
Yeah.
We want bread, but we want roses too. And the idea that we don't need all these consumer items, well, some of them we don't. But it really should be up to us to decide democratically what ones we want and what ones we don't.
So looking at, these examples, like, Walmart and Amazon is an example of these, giant corporations that basically are scale-wise states, like
Yes,
comparable
yeah,
to, like you
effectively.
said, Sweden or any other-
International states.
Yeah,
at that.
international. Yeah.
Yep.
And they're global, and they're extremely good at planning, and they're extremely good at getting us all these, things that
Fun
we
treats that
that
we
we
love.
want and or need in our lives. They're very good at that. But yet, like, let's say, like, okay, like we expand that, and like we have a like country like America run on the same principles of central planning. that's still one country that exists in a global market. And like Amazon or Walmart, there is a supply chain where all those nice, a lot of things that we like and want and need, sneakers or whatever, are manufactured in countries that are like, would still be, or would it, I'm asking, would it still be leveraging the cheap labor of other countries to produce the products that are efficiently distributed to us here as consumers or citizens of a centrally planned America?
Right. So,
and like, what are the implications of that? Or like, are the, like, would that just be replicating the same kind of
In
capitalist
the absence of an
exploitation
international left
that goes on right now?
Well, this is the question: is socialism possible in one country? And I think, my personal opinion, we don't talk about this in the book, but my personal opinion is that question has been firmly answered, that no, socialism is not possible in one country. It has to emerge as a global phenomenon. Now, how do we get there? That's another question. Again, we don't talk about that in the book. But if any country were to attempt to build socialism, you would immediately be confronted with questions not just of imperialism or dependence on extraction from other countries in potentially inegalitarian fashion, but also immediately you'd be confronted with capital strike and economic sabotage on the part of international finance, and so there's a range of reasons why socialism probably isn't feasible in one country.
I'm a
Maybe
socialist.
not. I don't know.
I'm a
It's
socialist in
not
one
in the
country
book.
kind of gal, but we all know this.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not it's not in the book. I'm less skeptical. It depends what we mean.
We have
by
a
socialism.
range
you
here
can have,
on the couch.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's a big. The question is correct. I mean, and it is a big issue. To what extent are you? To what extent do you depend on those sort of conditions elsewhere? And then to what extent do you depend on sort of price, like international prices,
But also-
and the choices that are being made for you through that, right? Again, which are like, that's deciding kind of how things relate to one another in a way that that isn't necessarily the kind of democratic thing that you'd hope would be happening.
But also, if we look at the way automation has improved, say manufacturing, textiles, things like that, and the fact that actually we do make things in America. That is like a big myth, is that like there are no factories left in America. There are. A lot of them are running on skeleton crews because they've become more efficient.
People don't make things in America anymore. It's,
Right,
like the ones that
So
are-
the idea that like we are entirely dependent on the exploitation of the third world for absolutely everything we have. No, that's the way things are organized right now, certainly.
yeah.
And I think there's going to be an international economy, the toothpaste is out of the tube of the 500 flavors of toothpaste you get in America now. But the idea that everything is necessarily dependent on the exploitation of the third world, to me, is completely absurd. We actually can be domestically very efficient and can trade in an ethical way.
I mean, we do have to take into account that there are many products where the components are made in dozens of different countries. The phone in your
Certainly.
pocket, maybe 60 different
Consumer
countries.
electronics are are the big one.
Consumer electronics, but almost everything that you from the paper, from the Kleenexes to the notebooks in front of you, mining is plays an enormous role in many of the aspects of that, as well as forestry and all of these things happen. We are fundamentally internationally connected economy now, and we're not going to retreat from that.
Right.
Nor should we.
Yeah.
So when we talk about developing democratic planning, we do have to think about extending that on a sort of global scale.
especially in the case of something like climate change or these big problems that we face that aren't concentrated in one country. If we burn fossil fuels here, they don't stay within the borders of the U.S. I mean, the other big asterisk here is we don't like. I think the book in many ways is sort of the book about where we are now. It's not really a book about like central planning in one country, in one city, in one neighborhood, or globally. It's really a book about the idea of planning and bringing that back and just bringing back this debate. Like we used to have these debates between the left and the right, and we used to put forward strong kind of utopian arguments around this stuff, and then 40, 50 years of neoliberalism, and all of us sort of have really constrained imaginations. So I think we're sort of back at that stage where we just need to start bringing back these big old ideas for the left, and thinking about the fact that we could put democracy into the economy, and then I think we're far away from like large scale plans. Like, what would it?
Especially since we have the success story. Like it's a mixed bag. As Marx once said, capitalism is a mixed bag. But like we do have this. I'm paraphrasing. We do have this success story of like, look, the capitalists can't say that planning doesn't work.
Yeah.
Their favorite projects are the result of very efficient planning.
That's effectively all we're saying. We are not. There's no blueprint in our book, in our little blue book, for how to build socialism. We are very modest and humble in what we're saying here, hopefully, in that we are simply taking on the argument that planning at scale is impossible, and we are using the best examples that capitalism has to Walmart's the most profitable. It's the biggest corporation in the world.